These are interventions, right? Before we're just simply observing what people are doing and making associations with health outcomes. Now we're intervening and we're saying, no, do this instead of what you were normally going to do. And we'll see if there's a change in a particular measure outcome that they're tracking in comparison to somebody else who is not doing that intervention, but is doing the regular thing that they would be normally doing. So the authors say most randomized trials of nutrient intake and clinical events have been relatively small in size. And this is, of course, true across the board. When you do observational studies, you can follow large numbers of people, but when you intervene, it's difficult, like I said, logistically and financially to do these intervention studies on large sample sizes. Authors go on to say these were also conducted some 40 to 50 years ago, and there hasn't been much kind of recent updates on these randomized controlled trials. And they also go on to say these trials have important methodological flaws. They go on to describe these further subsequently. I won't go into that. But let's go over what the evidence shows. So the first randomized controlled trial they quote is this one called Women's Health Initiative. And this is actually a pretty large trial. They have nearly 49,000 women, it says, which demonstrated that the risk of heart attack and stroke was unaffected after 8 years on a low-fat diet in which saturated fat provided 9.5% of total energy intake. All right, so 9.5% is just at the cusp of that 10% limit that is recommended, right? They say less than 10%, you should have saturated fat. So if you bump your amount to the max amount that is recommended, even after 8 years, you're probably fine. The second piece of evidence they present, PREDIMED trial. This trial compared a standard low-fat diet with a Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts or olives. And despite an increase in total fat intake by 4.5% of total energy, including slightly higher saturated fat consumption, major cardiovascular events and death were significantly reduced compared with the control group. So this is a great bit of evidence. So what this tells me with the two kind of pieces of evidence we have in front of us, there doesn't seem to be any studies done where they actually look at high amounts of saturated fat intake and see if that has a particular outcome that's bad for your health. The first one was 9.5%. The second was you increase the total amount of fat and only a little bit in saturated fat. And again, no issues with cardiovascular events or death. And then the last piece of evidence they provide is they say the 6 most recent systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized trials, many of which were small and conducted more than 40 years ago, but still comprise the core current dietary recommendations. So reviews and analyses of like these small studies on which the current recommendations stand on, results showed, according to these reviews and analyses, results showed that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat has no significant effect on coronary outcomes or on total mortality. All right, so I did not go into these, again, these sources to make sure that what they say here is in fact what I find in these studies. But if I trust the author, then it seems very silly that these small studies from 40 years ago that people rely on to say that the current recommendations of lowering saturated fat, when we review and reanalyze these studies all taken together, we find that there's actually no benefit to replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated or healthy fat. Okay. And the second conclusion the authors come up with is they say that a large body of information that raises question regarding conventional beliefs about saturated fatty acids and clinical outcomes. So taken together, the evidence from both cohort observational studies and randomized trials does not support the assertion that further restriction of dietary fat will reduce clinical events. There you go. I can't put it any clearer than that. There's no point in reducing saturated fat when both observational and randomized controlled trials show that there's no benefit.